There is a specific historical pattern that has toppled three major governments in the last 250 years. It is not a theory, it is an algorithm. And right now, in 2025, the United States is following that exact same pattern. Stage by stage, debt by debt. It is almost like we are reading from a script written in blood and chaos. In 1789, France was the undisputed superpower of Europe. It was wealthy, cultured, and advanced. Paris was the center of the world. Yet, within just 5 years, the government was liquidated. The king was beheaded, and the country descended into the Terror, where 40,000 people were executed for political crimes. In 1917, Russia was a colossal empire. The Tsar ruled over 180 million subjects. The military had just mobilized for a world war. Yet, in only 8 months, the entire regime evaporated. The Tsar was executed, and the empire collapsed into a civil war that claimed millions. In 1959, Cuba was the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean. It was a prosperous nation, with American investment and a functioning economy. 2 years later, it had turned into a communist dictatorship that lasted 60 years. 3 times, 3 different centuries, one identical 6-stage cycle. In every single case, the elites never saw it coming. They thought they were untouchable. They believed their financial systems were too big to fail. They were wrong every single time. And if you look at the United States today, every warning sign is flashing red. Extreme wealth inequality, government corruption, a national debt of $36 trillion, a complete loss of faith in institutions. We are not heading toward the pattern. We are currently locked in stage 4. This is the financial dossier of how a nation collapses from the inside. It does not start with gunfire. It starts with the ledger. History says stage 5 and 6 come fast. The only question is, have you prepared for stage 6? Before we analyze the specific data points of the American economy, you must understand what a revolution actually is. It is not a protest. It is not a riot. It is not political change. A revolution is when the existing order is completely destroyed and replaced with something new, and historically, often something worse. It is a total liquidation of the current social hierarchy. John F. Kennedy defined the mathematics of this collapse perfectly when he said that those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. This is not radical theory. It is a historical constant. When the mechanism for reform breaks, the mechanism for destruction takes over, and history proves it every single time. But here's the critical economic reality that most people miss. Revolutions do not happen because people are poor. Poverty has existed for all of human history. If poverty alone caused revolutions, the world would be in a perpetual state of war. Revolutions happen when expectations exceed reality. They happen when a population believes they deserve better than what they have, and when the gap between the elites and everyone else becomes so extreme that the social contract breaks. The social contract is a simple financial agreement. The citizens pay taxes and obey the law, and in exchange, the government provides security, justice, and a functioning economy. But when people lose faith that the system can fix itself, when they believe the government, the courts, and the elections are incapable of addressing their grievances, the contract is void. When people feel the game is rigged, they stop playing by the rules and start flipping the board. France, Russia, Cuba. 3 different centuries, 3 different ideologies, but they follow the exact same 6-stage sequence. Here's the roadmap, the death spiral algorithm that every collapsing empire follows. Stage 1 is extreme wealth inequality. This is the foundation. The wealth concentrates into the hands of a tiny percentage of the population, while the majority struggles to survive. The capital flow stops circulating and starts stagnating at the top. Stage 2 is government corruption and incompetence. The ruling class becomes disconnected from reality. They refuse to cut spending, they refuse to reform, and they use debt to paper over the cracks until the math no longer works. Stage 3 is where the middle class is destroyed and radicalized. This is the pivot point. Revolutions are not led by the starving poor. They are led by the educated middle class, the lawyers, merchants, and students who have been denied a future. This phenomenon has a name in structural demographic theory. It is called elite overproduction. A stable society works like a pyramid. There are many positions at the bottom, but very few positions of power at the top. In a healthy economy, the educated class is absorbed into these are brilliant, ambitious, educated people who have been promised a seat at the table, only to find the door locked by the older generation. A lawyer without a client is just a revolutionary in waiting. A graduate with debt but no assets is a demolition expert looking for a fuse. When the ladder of social mobility breaks, the people standing on the bottom rungs do not try to fix the ladder. They try to burn down the building. This intra-elite conflict is the engine of stage 3. It turns the universities and the media, arguably the guardians of the system, into the primary factories of its destruction. Stage 4 is the loss of faith in institutions. This is the point of no return, the moment the public stops believing in the legitimacy of the courts, the media, and the electoral process. Stage 5 is when the revolutionary movement gains mass support. Opportunistic leaders step into the vacuum, promising simple solutions to complex problems. They gain power not because they are loved, but because the current system is hated. Age 6 is when the government is overthrown, the system collapses, chaos follows, and usually a dictatorship emerges from the ashes to restore order at the cost of freedom. This pattern holds true whether the regime is a monarchy, a communist dictatorship, or a republic. The economics of collapse are universal. Let us examine the first case study. France in 1789, the mother of all modern revolutions. To understand why the guillotine fell, you have to look at the tax code. In the 1780s, France was the center of European civilization, but beneath the surface, the fiscal structure was completely broken. The population of 27 million was divided into 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility, combined made up only about 1.5% of the population. Yet they owned over 35% of the land, and, most importantly, paid almost zero taxes. The third estate, the other 98.5% of the population, carried the entire financial burden of the empire. This was a system designed to extract wealth from the productive class, to subsidize the leisure class. While the nobility hosted lavish parties at Versailles, completely disconnected from the economic reality outside their gates, the peasantry was being crushed. The gap was not just economic, it was a total disconnect from reality. The catalyst for the explosion was sovereign debt. France was effectively bankrupt from fighting centuries of wars, including financing the American Revolution against the British. The government owed billions. King Louis XVI was not a tyrant. He was a weak executive running a failed business. His solution to the debt crisis was a national Ponzi scheme. He borrowed new money to pay the interest on old money. When the lenders stopped lending, he tried to raise taxes on the peasants who had nothing left to give. But the debt was not the only poison. The cure was worse. To solve the liquidity crisis, the revolutionary government made a fatal mistake that modern central banks are repeating today. They tried to print their way to prosperity. They introduced a new paper currency called the assignat, backed theoretically by the value of seized church lands. Initially, it looked like a miracle. Money flooded into the economy. Debts were paid and trade spiked. But it was a monetary hallucination. The government, addicted to the short-term high of easy money, kept the printing presses running 24 hours a day. Within years, the volume of paper money exploded, but the production of goods collapsed. The laws of economics took their revenge. The assignat lost 99% of its value. This destroyed the savers, the merchants and the honest workers who saw their life savings turn into worthless confetti. Meanwhile, speculators with access to the printing press bought up real assets, land and commodities, creating a new class of ultra-rich predators amidst the starvation. This financial looting radicalized the population far more than any political speech ever could. When money dies, society dies with it. Then came the inflation shock. By 1788, a bad harvest caused the price of grain to spike. For the average French worker, bread was not just food, it was their primary source of energy. By 1789, the price of bread had doubled, consuming 88% of a peasant's entire household budget. When the cost of survival exceeds 80% of income, society creates a vacuum that only violence can fill. The people were not just angry, they were starving. And the nobility refused to cut a single expense. This is the moment the system actually died. The revolution was not organized by the starving peasants. It was organized by the educated middle class, the lawyers, merchants, and intellectuals. Louis XVI called the Estates General, a parliamentary body, to rubber stamp new taxes. He thought it would legitimize his theft. Instead, it backfired. The middle class realized the game was rigged against them. The nobility and clergy could always outvote them 2-1. Realizing that reform within the system was impossible, the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly. They locked themselves in a tennis court and vowed not to leave until they had written a new constitution. This was the tennis court oath. It was the moment the educated class declared the government illegitimate. On July 14, 1789, the loss of faith turned into action. Parisians stormed the Bastille prison. They did not just want to release prisoners. They wanted the gunpowder. They killed the guards and paraded their heads on pikes through the streets. The monopoly on violence had shifted. The king had lost his army. The banks had lost their confidence. And the road to the guillotine was open. If France was the failure of culture, Russia was the failure of scale. By 1917, the Russian Empire was a massive feudal structure ruling 180 million people. But beneath the imperial facade, the financial ledger was bleeding red. First, there was total asset concentration. The Tsar and the nobility owned everything. The peasants, who made up 80% of the population, owned nothing. It was a medieval economic structure trying to survive in the 20th century. Then came the cost of incompetence. Tsar Nicholas II was a disaster who believed in his divine right to rule, making him completely immune to reality. When he entered World War I, it exposed the system's bankruptcy. The logistics collapsed. Millions of soldiers were sent to the front lines without equipment, often fighting without bullets. The result was 3 million casualties. The financial trigger for this catastrophe happened 3 years prior, in 1914. To finance the war, Russia suspended the gold standard. For decades, the Russian ruble had been one of the most stable currencies in Europe, anchored by gold reserves. But the moment the government detached the currency from reality to print money for war, the clock started ticking. The money supply multiplied by 800% in 3 years. But prices did not just rise, they vanished into the stratosphere. Farmers stopped selling grain to the cities because the paper money they received was worthless by the time they walked to the market. This broke the supply chain. The starvation in Petrograd was not caused by a lack of food. It was caused by a lack of money that people could trust. The Bolsheviks did not defeat the Tsar's army on the battlefield. The printing press defeated the Tsar's army from the central bank. Economically, the war machine destroyed the currency. When the army, the ultimate guarantor of the state's debts, refuses to defend the government, the regime is finished. The Romanov dynasty ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Now, let us jump to the most dangerous misconception in modern history: Cuba. Most people think revolutions only happen in poor, backward nations. That is false. In the 1950s, Cuba was not a poor country. It had one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. Havana was the Monte Carlo of the Caribbean, filled with casinos, American tourists, and investment. The problem was not a lack of wealth, it was the distribution of it. The wealth was entirely concentrated in Havana and among elites connected to dictator Fulgencio Batista. Batista ran the country like a crime syndicate. American mobsters ran the casinos and paid him a cut. The government existed solely to enrich the inner circle. This leads us to the critical data point. Fidel Castro was not a starving peasant. He was a lawyer from a wealthy family. He was educated and could have been part of the ruling elite, but he saw the corruption and chose to burn the system down. Revolutions succeed when the educated class, the lawyers, the doctors, the students, decide that the current order offers them no future. When the best and brightest turn against the state, the countdown, the stage begins. This is the most critical chapter of the dossier. It explains why the cure is almost always deadlier than the disease. By stage 5, the vacuum created by the government's incompetence must be filled. This is when organized revolutionary movements gain mass support. In France, it was the Jacobins. In Russia, the Bolsheviks. In Cuba, the 26th of July movement. But here's the psychological reality that history books often sanitize. The masses do not support these groups because they love their ideology. They support them because they hate the current regime more. Desperation creates a market for demagogues, and demagogues always sell the same product: simple solutions to complex structural problems. Robespierre promised virtue. Lenin promised peace, land, and bread. Fidel Castro explicitly promised the restoration of the Constitution and free elections. These promises are designed to be intoxicating. They offer immediate relief to a population suffering from inflation, hunger, and corruption. But in the mathematics of revolution, these promises are fraudulent. They are merely the acquisition cost of power. Once the old government is overthrown, the trap snaps shut. Stage 6 is not liberation. It is chaos followed by tyranny. The first casualty of every successful revolution is the revolutionary coalition itself. The extremists always purge the moderates. In France, the Reign of Terror did not just target the nobility. It targeted fellow revolutionaries who were not radical enough. Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the terror, sent thousands to the guillotine. Eventually, the machine he built turned on him, and he was beheaded by the same system he created. Revolutions devour their own children, always. In Russia, the Bolsheviks seized power and immediately plunged the country into a civil war that killed 10 million people. Lenin's promise of peace meant surrender. His promise of bread meant starvation and rationing. When Stalin took over, he did not just kill the monarchists, he executed the original Bolsheviks who knew too much. In Cuba, the lawyers and students who supported Castro to remove a dictator woke up to find they had installed a new one. Within months, the free press was censored. Political opponents were executed without fair trials. The middle class that funded the revolution became its first victims. They learned too late that they had traded a corrupt authoritarian for a totalitarian ideologue. The pattern is absolute. The chaos of stage 6 creates a power vacuum that cannot be filled by democracy. It can only be filled by brute force. France got Napoleon, Russia got Stalin. Cuba got 60 years of the Castro family. The lesson is simple and terrifying. Chaos does not bring freedom, it brings a new, more efficient form of slavery. Now, let us overlay this historical template onto the United States in 2025. The data is not just alarming, it is a perfect match. When we check the data for stage 1, we see extreme wealth inequality. The wealth gap in America today is mathematically larger than it was in France before the Revolution. In 1789, the French nobility flaunted their wealth while peasants starved. Today, the top 0.1% of American households own roughly the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90% combined. We are living in an economy where the elite book private space travel, while millions of Americans work 3 jobs and still cannot afford rent. This is not capitalism. This is a neo-feudal structure where asset inflation benefits the few and price inflation crushes the many. Stage 1 is confirmed. To understand the mechanics of this inequality, you must look at the Cantillon effect. This is an economic principle from the 18th century that explains our current reality perfectly. It states that when new money is printed, it does not enter the economy evenly. It enters through the financial sector, benefiting the first receivers of the new money, the banks, the corporations, and the asset holders. Before prices rise, by the time that money trickles down to the working class, it has already caused inflation. The elite get the asset appreciation. The working class gets the grocery bill. This is not an accident. It is the feature of the central banking system. It transfers wealth from the savers to the debtors, and from the workers to the speculators. When we check stage 2 and 3, we see systemic corruption and middle-class destruction. Faith in the U.S. Congress has collapsed to near 15%. Why? Because the public correctly perceives that the government no longer serves them. Corruption has been legalized. It is called lobbying and congressional insider trading. Meanwhile, the American middle class, the stabilizing force of any democracy, is being hollowed out. For the first time in history, educated young people cannot achieve what their parents did. They are drowning in student debt for degrees that no longer guarantee a livelihood. Housing is unaffordable. Healthcare is a luxury. The American dream is dead on paper. When engineers, teachers, and lawyers realize they have no paper, they stop supporting the system and start looking for someone to blame. Stage 2 and 3 are confirmed. Furthermore, the mathematical inevitability of the U.S. debt situation is pushing us towards stage 5. We have entered a sovereign debt death spiral. For the first time in history, the United States government is spending more on interest payments for the national debt than it spends on national defense. Think about the gravity of that data point. We are spending more to service the mistakes of the past than to defend our future. To pay this interest, the government must issue more debt. To buy that debt, the Federal Reserve must print more money. To absorb that new money, inflation must rise. It is a closed loop of destruction. This weakness has not gone unnoticed. The BRICS alliance and the Global South are actively building alternative payment rails to bypass the US dollar. They know that a currency backed by $36 trillion in debt is a ticking time bomb. If the dollar loses its status as the global reserve currency, the trillions of dollars held overseas will flood back into the domestic U.S. economy. The result would be a hyperinflationary event that would make the 1970s look like a period of stability. This is the financial cliff edge that the mainstream media refuses to discuss. But debt is only the fuel. The spark is psychology. This brings us to a concept known as the velocity of money. Inflation is not just about how much money is printed, it is about how fast people spend it. In stages 1 through 3, the velocity is low because people save. But in stage 4, when trust evaporates, the velocity spikes. People rush to trade their dying currency for tangible assets. Gold, land, commodities, anything that cannot be printed. This psychological shift is what turns high inflation into hyperinflation. It happened in Weimar Germany, it happened in Zimbabwe. And the data suggests the psychological tipping point in America is closer than the Federal Reserve admits. Simultaneously, we face a silent liquidity crisis in the banking sector. Regional banks are sitting on hundreds of billions in unrealized losses from government bonds that have lost value due to rising rates. This is the exact same mechanism that triggered the 2023 banking tremors, but on a systemic scale. If the depositors wake up and realize their bank is insolvent, the run on the banks will not be physical lines around the block. It will be digital, instantaneous, and unstoppable. And finally, we check stage 4, the collapse of shared reality. We are currently living in stage 4, the total loss of faith in institutions. A society cannot function without a shared reality. Today, America is 2 separate nations occupying the same map. Half the country believes the 2020 election was stolen. The other half believes January 6th was an attempted coup. Neither side trusts the other. The institutions that are supposed to be neutral, the FBI, the Supreme Court, the mainstream media, are now viewed as weaponized political tools. The social contract is broken. The kindling is dry. All it takes now is a single spark, a contested election, a banking collapse, or a constitutional crisis to push the timeline into stage 5. The most fatal flaw of every dying empire is normalcy bias. It is the arrogant belief that because the system has lasted this long, it will last forever. France, Russia, Cuba. In every single instance, the elites thought they were the exception. They were wrong. Mathematics does not know bias. The laws of history do not care about American exceptionalism. The pattern is absolute. If you devalue the currency, corrupt the institutions, and ignore the grievances of the people, the result is always the same. So, what does stage 6 look like in America? It will not be guillotines in the public square. It will be much faster. It looks like a supply chain collapse, where grocery stores empty in 48 hours. It looks like a fractured power grid. It looks like the dollar becoming worthless paper, and political violence moving from the screen to your front door. The chaos could last for years, and what emerges on the other side might not be the America you know. Stage 5 is beginning. The answers you need to survive are not in the future. They are hiding in the history books that most people ignore. The warning has been issued. Prepare accordingly.
States.